Um, okay, so I think we'll do study overviews. Next slide. So I think as Jeff already basically discussed in his presentation, where our main objective is to do deep phenotyping of chronic low back patients. And I think one thing that's I'd say challenge that we have in our consortium is that we have a very expansive definition of deep phenotyping that includes functional MRI scans, QST, a very comprehensive battery of psychosocial questionnaires, and a very long period of follow-up out to 3 years actually. Whereas the other MRCs are collecting a smaller number of MRI scans and QST measures and things like that. They're using a strategy where they're basically doing, it's almost a convenience sample of their total cohort that they're doing these more advanced measures on. And we're taking a different approach where we're doing a deeper phenotyping on a larger number of patients, a smaller number of patients for a longer period of time. So that does, make recruitment and more importantly, retention more challenging. But that's, we have a lot of strategies in place that we hope we can leverage to achieve our goals. Next slide. So we have 2 studies. One is called Come Back, and the other is Back Home. So Come Back is sort of the major focuses of what we'll be discussing today. It's a longitudinal cohort study. Patients with chronic low back pain. We'll go through the inclusion and exclusion criteria later. As you all know, we have 4 clinical sites, and we're aiming to get data on a total of 400 patients. The study visit flow, I think Tricia will go into a little more detail later, but basically it's a baseline clinic visit with some check-ins at several intervals, some of that driven by requirements of heel and backpack, phone visits at 3, 6, 18, and 30 months, and then the major, time-intensive clinic visits occurring at baseline month 12, 24, and 36. So that's our goal, is to get 3 years of very rich data on this cohort of patients. The other study we have, which is actually really interesting and timely, as it turns out, is Back Home. And this is an e-cohort study that leverages a platform that's been developed here at UCSF called Eureka. This was a platform that was developed several years ago to facilitate a cardiovascular research study called Health eHeart. And it's everything is done digitally, so there's no in-person visits. It's obviously heavily weighted towards patient self-report measures, but within Health eHeart, they've also linked to a variety of remote sensors, some of them obvious like Fitbit, but they've also branched out into blood pressure monitoring and things like that. So it's a really interesting approach to doing clinical research, because it allows you to get a lot of data, not as structured as some of the data we're used to getting in clinical trials, but the numbers are pretty huge. I think Health eHeart has several 100,000 patients. They may be up to 1 million now. They just a few months ago started a COVID study, and they already have 35,000 patients over just a few months. So it's an interesting approach that we're going to hopefully learn more about on its use in low back pain. So our goals are relatively modest. We're trying to recruit 3,000 patients for this e-cohort. There's a little bit of work that has to be done at the sites for recruitment, but it's pretty minimal. And I think Trisha's going to go through that later. Is that right, Trisha?
Right. We'll go through
Okay.
this girl.
Oh,
Yeah, just a bit.
okay, great. So I won't go into that now. But we're taking an approach where in addition to the questionnaire data, we're also going to be getting EHR data on all these patients. So it allows for, some pretty robust data set actually that will complement our traditional cohort. The other thing that's interesting about this back home study, the e-cohort, is that there's a lot of digital interventions out there now. And we are actively looking at ways to incorporate these digital interventions into the trial. I was just on the phone this morning with AJ Wasan from Pittsburgh. They have an app, for example, they're using that they're interested in studying. So if any of you are into digital type things and want to have some proposal related to that, this would be the time, because we're just starting to sort of make formal plans for incorporating those things into back home. Next slide. So just to go through the inclusion criteria, again, these are criteria that are harmonized across all backpacks. So people may have different opinions about what constitutes low back pain, but this is what we have to work with. So it's basically a self-report of chronic low back pain, and that's a definition that's coming off of the NIH research standards that were developed several years ago now. And it's pain that's been there for at least 3 months and has resulted in pain at least 50% of the days in the past 6 months. So again, one could argue about what the definition of pain is, but that's chronic pain is that's what we have. We also, a lot of these patients have multi-site pain, but we want to restrict our study to patients that their worst pain is in the lower back. So that's another very important inclusion criteria. The rest of these are, I would say, fairly obvious. We want people that are, going to be around for at least a couple of years, that are going to comply with the study and provide informed consent, et cetera. Next slide. I think that's the same slide, isn't it? Oh, that's back home. I'm sorry. So yeah, back home it's basically the same. The only difference is that they have to have access to the internet, obviously, and some type of a device that allows them to comply with the study. Next slide. Exclusion criteria basically is a contraindication to MRI. They're pretty standard. We want to restrict our population to non-specific low back pain. It's sort of interesting that some of the MRCs had very few exclusion criteria, including they weren't excluding patients with cancer or connective tissue diseases, et cetera. But we've decided to, basically use the standard sort of definition of non-specific low back pain and exclude patients with tumors, infections, and inflammatory pain, et cetera. So those are all, I think, fairly straightforward. And then there's some other minor ones. Again, we want to be people that can be staying around for a couple of years. The pregnancy, again, trying to restrict our population to those with non-specific low back pain. And then we really cannot accommodate anything except English language speakers. Number 12, I think, is a little bit interesting. I don't think it's going to be an issue for most sites, but there may be a concern if patients are enrolling in another study of a device or some kind of drug that would interfere with the backpack study. And maybe I can just do an informal poll of Scott and Shalini and Joel, if you guys have any studies ongoing or planned that you think may in some way target the same population and potentially interfere with the back home or comeback, sorry.
Not at UCSD.
We don't have any at UC Irvine. No competing studies.
Okay,
And Scott said in the text, not for us.
great. So number 12 is a non-issue. Okay, next slide,
Oh,
please.
Connor, before you go on, sorry, I just wanted to mention really quickly about inclusion criteria number 11. This is Trisha. The reason why we are only enrolling people who are able to read and write the English language is because many of the questionnaires that we're using in the study are validated in English, and we don't have the ability to have them translated and then back translated and do the whole validation procedure. So unfortunately, we are restricted to enroll only those with the English language. And even if your site has a translator, we really prefer that the participant fill those forms out on their own because they're meant to be self-administered. So I just wanted to explain why number 11 was there, in case anybody has questions about that. Okay.
Great, so any other questions about the inclusion or exclusion criteria or the study overview in general?
Just for the exclusion criteria for the radiculopathy, they have to have weakness with that. Like they can have some referral of their back pain, correct?
Exactly. So the radiculopathy we're defining as a functional motor deficit of less than 4/5.
Great, thanks.
Okay, next slide. Back home is the same exclusion criteria essentially. Next slide. So just going through the study flow in brief, looking over here on the left-hand side of the screen, we see the baseline enrollment visit. So this consists of eligibility screening, consent obviously, the physical function exam, which we're going to be going through in some detail here. The MRI studies, there's a little bit of difference between the sites related to which MRI studies will be done based on the capabilities at the site. But at least there's a possibility of a patient getting a clinical MRI. Well, all patients will get a clinical MRI actually, but there's what we call advanced MRI, which is some special sequences that I think Aaron Fields is going to talk about later. There's MR spectroscopy, and then there's functional brain imaging. There's a QST, and luckily, in my opinion, the consortium took a sort of a minimalist approach to the QST. So we're going to be basically just doing pressure pain thresholds, the NeuroPen for temporal summation, and then a water bath. So we don't need the super expensive thermodes and $30,000 machines and so on. So that's a relief. Biological specimens. This actually has been one of the biggest issues that's causing delay in that all the different entities that do biologic specimen collection and processing have been overwhelmed by COVID issues, but seems like we have that ironed out and we're going to be able to move forward with that. And then we have our core questionnaires and our biobehavioral questionnaires, and I think those are pretty straightforward. I think everyone here is going to be, very familiar with these questionnaires, and if not, at least the underlying domain that they're addressing. Next slide. So then the month 3 visit, this is something we were not anticipating initially when we designed the study, but it was inserted at the, I think it was HEAL actually that requires this, that they have a month 3, and this will just be via phone and email where they answer some of the core questionnaires, so no other data collected other than self-report. There are also some other briefer check-ins. This is something that was added recently by I can't remember who added that. Was that Backpack, Tricia, or was that the MRCs?
But that was backpack.
Okay, so that's another one of these things that Backpack as a consortium said that you guys have to do this, so we have to throw this in here. Unfortunately, it's a very short questionnaire that can be answered by email, so it shouldn't be too big of a burden. Next slide. And then the month 6 visit is again a phone/email contact that basically involves just questionnaires, and that's will be at the 6th, 18th, and 30-month intervals. Next slide. And then the yearly intervals are where we do the deep dive on, again, remeasuring physical function, collecting specimens, doing MRI scans, at least at the 24-month time point. Any questions about the study flow? We're going to be going into this in a lot more detail, so this is just a sort of a high-level overview of how things will flow. This all seems crystal clear. Okay, good. Next slide. So this is a more detailed description, and this is probably not the right moment to go through all this in detail. Tricia, unless you wanted to
Oh,
do
no.
a deep dive on this now, or?
I think we just wanted to emphasize that we are collecting a lot of data. So
Yeah.
there's like 3 of these slides. And just to give you the idea of the depth of data that we are collecting in this study, and we'll be working very closely with all of the sites to help you along with this. We understand that it's arduous, and working with the participants for, you know, such a long day in the clinic for the clinic visits. We'll try our best to help you manage the visit flow and make this as easy as possible on both of you, you and the participants.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a good illustration of just how the depth of data we're going to be collecting, which seems in some respects overwhelming, but on the other hand, it's such an opportunity to really characterize on many different levels patients with low back pain. So it's definitely ambitious, but if we can pull it off, it's going to be a huge step forward for the whole field. Next slide. So this again, more of the same. This sort of just provides the biobehavioral questionnaires, and obviously we'll be giving a lot more detail about all those. Next slide. The physical function, Sarah Ringling's going to go over QST. We have some information about that. I think that's actually pretty straightforward. The spine imaging, we're going to have a whole section about that today on the spine imaging. Way down at the bottom there is EHR data collection. That's something we're still sort of figuring out the mechanics around that. It's UC has an ambition of having all EHR data being available in one sort of location for the entire UC system. That hasn't happened yet. And so there's going to be some complexities around collecting the EHR data that we're going to have to work through, and that's sort of an evolving process.
So we're working with the Office of the President right now, and then after this meeting and after we talk to them, the UC-wide, we'll be contacting each of your sites, and I'll be meeting with probably the study coordinators first to start figuring out how we can work within your organization to get this data to us. So we should have more information in the next week or so, and then I'll be meeting with each of your sites individually.
Next slide. So now we'll shift into back home, and this excuse me, this is something that it's still evolving a little bit. We actually haven't started programming yet, but basically the concept is that we're asking patients to fill out more or less the same questionnaires that we're doing in our main cohort study. We have stripped out a few that have, some maybe a questionable value, or at least are on the margins. And these are presented to patients in modules, and each module is introduced with sort of a brief overview of why we're asking these questions, because sometimes people, they might, I think they wonder why the heck are they asking me about depression? I'm not depressed. And this is really based on the Healthy Heart format, where they give some explanations to patients as they go through while they're being asked various things about their cardiovascular health and so on. Next slide. I think we can skip over that. It's basically just the questionnaires that we're going to be using. So this is an example of how this flow is going to be sort of presented to patients, giving them some context for why they're being asked about, for example, anxiety and depression. Next slide. Similar type thing. Next slide. There's a lot of data on there. I think the only point there is that they're going to be getting touches at various time points out to 36 months, which at the shorter intervals will be brief, and at longer interval at the yearly visits will be a little more comprehensive. So similar concept as with the main cohort study with Comeback. Next slide. This is again back home. I think we can advance through that. That's I think more or less covered in the previous slides. Just that there's a lot of questionnaires, but not quite as many as with Backpack. I'm sorry, as with Comeback. Next slide. Okay, I think this is where we transition to Tricia. I just want to mention, real briefly that this is a ton of work. We totally understand that, and we are completely at your service to, if there's any issues, any things that come up that aren't working right, or things that we can do, please, engage. And we anticipate having a lot of conversations, both at the, with CRCs, with investigators, with anybody that is involved with your site. We definitely want to make it as easy as possible, and we're willing to do whatever we feasibly can to do that.
Connor, I thought one other point just to raise is that the front end of the funnel for these patients is going to be an electronic health record, a search for those who are in the UC system that meet our definition of inclusion exclusion. And I don't know if Tricia, you want to mention briefly about how we made.
We have some slides to go over that if you want to chime in at that time.
Great, thank you.
Okay,